Okay, I need a moment. Because when I finished The Dark Locket, Secrets of the Sanatorium by Chris Witt, I closed the book, stared at the cover, and genuinely wondered what exactly did I just experience? Not because I disliked it, and not because I couldn't follow it, but because somewhere along the way, Chris Witt managed to dismantle my confidence in what I thought I understood. Every time I believed I had found solid ground, the story quietly moved it beneath my feet. And every time I thought I understood what was real, another revelation forced me to reconsider it. And every time I thought I understood Harold, I realized there was another locked door inside his mind, and eventually I stopped asking myself what's going to happen next. And then I started asking myself, can I really trust anything I've already seen? That's a completely different kind of reading experience because the Dark Locket doesn't simply invite you into the Laos Sanatorium, it leads you through the doors, closes them behind you, and slowly begins extinguishing the lights one by one. By the time you realize you've lost your bearings, you're already too deep inside the labyrinth to even turn around and has you questioning what real and what isn't. So tonight we're gonna bring this one back from the Read It and Rant archives because some books entertain you, some books frighten you, some books surprise you, and then there are books that quietly rearrange your perception of reality while you're reading them. The Dark Locket by Chris Witt did exactly that to me. All right, this is the Rant Revival. All right, welcome back to the Read It Rant podcast.
Welcome to the Read It and Rant podcast, where we don't sugarcoat anything, no filters, no holding back, just raw, loud opinions. So turn it up and get ready.
Welcome back to the Read It and Rant podcast, where we don't sugarcoat anything. I am your host, Tony, and welcome to the Rant Revival. This is where we're digging through the Read It and Rant archives and bringing books back into the spotlight. Books I've already reviewed, books that really deserve another conversation, and books that really deserve another chance to be discovered. And sometimes books that simply refuse to leave my mind after I finish them. These aren't recycled reviews, these are fresh rants, fresh recordings, fresh perspectives, and another opportunity to put a great book back in front of readers, because around here, great books deserve a second, third, fourth, and endless rant. And tonight, we're going to resurrect a psychological thriller from the dead that make me question perception, memory, and chronology, and eventually my own interpretation of what I was reading. And that book is Chris Witt's The Dark Locket, Secrets of the Sanatorium. So let's get into it, all right? On the surface, the premise sounds straightforward. Harold's fiancée, Emily, disappears, Excuse me, his search eventually leads him to Laos Sanatorium, an abandoned institution connected to Emily's research. Immediately, you've got everything you need for a dark psychological thriller. There's a disappearance, an abandoned sanatorium, a desperate man searching for answers, a mysterious past. But the Dark Locket isn't content with simply asking the reader where is Emily, because Harold doesn't just discover clues about Emily inside Laos. He begins discovering fragments of himself, his childhood, his memories, things he has forgotten, things perhaps buried somewhere so deeply inside his consciousness that they become almost inaccessible. And then there's the bronze locket, an object that increasingly feels like a piece of jewelry and more like a key, except we're not really entirely sure what it's unlocking. Is it a memory, a secret, or a buried reality, or just something else entirely? And that's where this book began pulling me into its psychological labyrinth. Because the deeper Harold travels into the Laos Sanatorium, the less certain everything becomes. Past and present really begin overlapping. Memories return in fragments. Perception becomes increasingly unreliable. And suddenly the question isn't simply where is Emily, it's what happened to Harold. Then what happened inside this place, and finally, what exactly can I trust? And the Laos Sanatorium is one of my favorite really elements of the story because it doesn't feel like a location. It feels like a demonic presence. Like there's something deeply unsettling about the way the sanatorium hangs over Harold's journey. Every corridor feels like it might contain an answer, every room feels like it might awaken something, and every familiar sensation raises another question. And because Harold has a forgotten connection to this place, exploring Laos begins to feel less like investigating a building and more like excavating a mind. That's where the atmosphere really worked for me. The sanatorium almost becomes a physical manifestation of suppressed memory. There's doors, hallways, rooms, darkness, fragments. Like you keep moving deeper, and so does Harold. And the moment that the Dark Locket truly got inside my head, at some point, I just realized I could no longer confidently distinguish between the present, past memory, um, perception, possible hallucination, and potentially something beyond rational explanation. Normally, that much uncertainty could become frustrating, but here, that uncertainty is really the experience. Harold doesn't really have complete access to the truth, and neither do we. We're not observing his confusion from a comfortable distance, we're like inhabiting it. And that distinction, I think, really matters because suddenly the reader isn't standing outside Harold's mind trying to understand him. We're standing inside it with him. Like the walls are moving, the memories are incomplete, the chronology is unstable, and we're starting to assemble a puzzle without knowing whether some of the pieces belong to the puzzle entirely. That's when I realized that this book had me by the hooks. And then there's this object sitting at the center of everything, which is the locket. And I love when an author can take an ordinary object and gradually make it feel threatening simply because of what it represents. The Locket seriously becomes entangled with Harold's past, the mysteries surrounding Lois, and the memories, beginning to emerge. And every time it appears, there's this feeling that another door is about to open. The problem is you don't know what's behind it, and or even waiting, behind it. That's what fascinated me about the symbolism. A locket is traditionally something that holds a memory, a photograph, a person, a moment, something we want to preserve. But what happens when the memories being preserved are the ones you're desperately trying to forget? And then suddenly the title becomes much more interesting because perhaps the darkness isn't contained inside the locket. Perhaps the locket simply opens the door to darkness that was already there. Um, and I gotta give a shout out to the author because I want Chris Witt. Please take a seat at the rant table. We need to discuss what you just put me through when I read this book months ago. Because there were moments where I was absolutely convinced I understood what was happening. I had the pieces arranged. I had my theory. I understood the mystery. I knew where we were going. Then another revelation appeared, and suddenly my entire interpretation really collapsed. So I reconstructed it. There was a new theory, new explanation, and now everything makes sense. Except it didn't, because another piece appeared, and another and another. Eventually, I felt less like a reader and more like an investigator standing in front of a wall covered in photographs, timelines, notes, and pieces of string. There were Harold, Emily, Lois, the Locket, childhood, memory, past, present, perception, reality. What connects what to what? And more importantly, which connections can I actually trust? That's when the book crossed from mystery into something far more psychologically interesting, because eventually I wasn't questioning the story anymore. I was questioning my interpretation of the story. And Chris, my buddy, that was remarkably effective. However, this is where I think the Dark Locket becomes more interesting than its premise initially suggests, because underneath the abandoned sanatorium and psychological suspense is a story deeply rooted in concern with memory. Like, what do we remember? What do we forget? What does the mind deliberately bury? And what happens when something we bury refuses to remain buried? That idea unsettles me considerably more than any conventional monster could. Like, imagine discovering an entire portion of your existence remains somewhere inside your consciousness, but you cannot access it. You know something is there, you feel its presence, but the door is locked. Now imagine returning to that place where those memories originated and suddenly the door begins opening. Not all at once, not cleanly, not chronologically, fragment by fragment by fragment. That is seriously terrifying because Harold isn't simply exploring the Laois Sanatorium, he's exploring the architecture of his own memory. And some doors inside the human mind were locked for a reason. And honestly, I think when the topic that when time stopped feeling safe, it might have been one of the most um, intriguing elements that really disoriented me the most. Chronology is normally something readers can depend on. This happened, and then that happened, past, present, future. Simple, except once Harold's memories begin bleeding into his present experience, time itself really becomes unstable. Because sometimes I felt like we're moving forward and then backward. It felt like both were happening simultaneously. And honestly, that's what makes the sanatorium the perfect setting because the deeper Harold physically travels into the sanatorium, the deeper he psychologically travels into himself. The building almost becomes metaphorical at times. Hallways become memories. Rooms really become revelations. Doors become questions. And the locket becomes a symbol for everything sealed away inside Harold's consciousness. That's where this book became far more than simply a thriller for me. And this is probably my favorite part. Eventually, the Dark Locket doesn't just make you distrust Harold's perception, it makes you distrust your own. Like, did I miss something? Was that detail important? Was that actually happening? Was that foreshadowing? Did the author already give me the answer and I simply didn't recognize it? Suddenly, you're mentally revisiting earlier scenes, and that's the moment a psychological thriller becomes genuinely effective. Because the book isn't merely withholding information; it's making you reinterpret information you already possess. That's considerably more difficult and considerably more rewarding. And there's also an important distinction I want to make here. There's confusion caused by poor storytelling, and there's intentional disorientation. They are not the same thing. Poor confusion happens when the reader doesn't have enough information to engage with the story. Intentional disorientation happens when the reader has enough information to form a theory, but not enough information to know whether that theory can be trusted. The Dark Locket gave me the second experience. It kept giving me breadcrumbs, so I followed them. I constructed theories. A lot of them collapsed, and then I had to reconstruct them. Those collapsed too, and eventually I realized something. The instability was really deliberate. The reader is supposed to feel uncertain because Harold feels uncertain. We're solving the mystery alongside someone who cannot completely trust his own memories. How are we supposed to trust him? And without really touching too much spoilers, there comes a point where the Dark Locket really changes. Like pieces really do begin connecting, questions begin receiving answers, and you start experiencing that wonderful thriller reader sensation. Like, wait, hold on, like I remember that. Those kind of things. And suddenly something that seemed insignificant 50 or 100 pages earlier becomes relevant. Like a moment really changes everything. A detail really gains significance, and a scene you thought you understood becomes something completely different. That's what I want from a psychological thriller. Like, don't merely surprise me, make me reconsider what I already read. A surprise exists for a moment, a great revelation reaches backward through the entire story and alters everything that came before it. Those are the twists that really stayed with me. And then we reach the ending. And I'm obviously not going to spoil it. This is absolutely a book where the less you know going in, the better the experience becomes. But when I finished it, I didn't immediately move on. I honestly stared at the book because suddenly my brain began replaying everything: the Sanatorium, the Locket, Harold, Emily, the memories, the chronology, the things I thought I understood. And I started asking myself, was my interpretation actually correct? That's the highest compliment I can give this kind of story. The ending didn't merely conclude the narrative, it forced me to mentally revisit it. And I think this book really isn't going to work for every reader. If you need immediate explanations, this may really test your patience. If ambiguity bothers you, you're going to have questions. If you want a completely linear psychological thriller where reality remains firmly defined, this probably isn't your book. But if you enjoy psychological mind F's, such as labyrinths, and if you enjoy unreliable perception, fragmented memory, atmosphere, locations, stories where reality becomes increasingly difficult to define, this is absolutely worth exploring. Especially if you love finishing a book immediately needing to discuss it with somebody else, because The Dark Locket practically demands a post-reading conversation, which is why we're having it right now. Um, and my final rant: The Dark Locket reminded me why psychological thrillers can sometimes be more unsettling than conventional horror. Like, a monster is tangible as well as a murderer or a haunted building. You can identify those threats, but what happens when the threat is uncertainty itself? What happens when memory really becomes unreliable? And what happens when perception cannot be trusted? And what happens when you can no longer know whether the thing haunting you exists somewhere else in the darkness or even inside your own consciousness? That's what really stayed with me. Like, I didn't finish The Dark Locket like simply thinking that was creepy. I finished it thinking I need to reconsider like everything I thought was real and everything I just read. Then a few minutes later, I was like, wait, I think I understand. Then, no, perhaps I don't. Then, wait a minute. And suddenly, I had another theory that emerged. That's when you know a psychological thriller really succeeded in giving you a hardcore mind F, because you just close the book and your mind is still like, what did I just read? And your mind's still reading it. Um, and my rant revival verdict for Chris Witt's The Dark Locket, Secrets of the Sanatorium. This book is a psychological thriller, psychological labyrinth disguised as a thriller. It's atmospheric, disorienting, unsettling, mysterious, cerebral, and above all else, it refuses to let reality remain comfortable. And this isn't a book I want to explain to you. I don't want to give you the answers. I don't even want to tell you exactly which questions you should be asking. I just want to hand you that book, point you toward the doors of Lauer's Sanatorium, and say, go inside. Then come find me when you make it back out, because we're going to have a very long conversation. All right? And that's going to do it for another episode of the Rant Revival, back from the archives, back in the spotlight, in this particular case, back inside this head. And if you read The Dark Locket, I want to know, did this book dismantle your sense of reality as thoroughly as it dismantled mine? And when you reached the ending, did you like immediately start reconsidering everything that came before it? And I want to please keep the comments spoiler free for anyone really who hasn't really read it yet. And if you haven't read it, go into this one knowing as little as possible. I think you'll thank me later. I'm Tony. This has been the Read It and Rant podcast, where we don't sugarcoat anything. That was my first inaugural episode of the Rant Revival. And remember, great books don't belong buried in the archives. Great books deserve a second and unlimited rant. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning. If you ever find yourself standing outside the doors of an abandoned sanatorium, perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved. All right? Read It and Rant is out.